Morning, this is Spencer Brown recording for Module 17, the final module for AEP 858. In this module, we were tasked with establishing a protocol for looking at data and how we can kind of drill down to what would be the best for instructional decision making based on the data. And so this was a fun assignment for me because in my job as Kansas FTSS and Alignment, we actually have these protocols. And so this was an opportunity for me to just step away from that cycle and take kind of what we do and think about different ways of approaching it based on things I've learned in this class. And so actually what I did, in our model, we use a simple cycle of look, think, and act at all levels: district level, building level, and collaborative team level. And so there's some assumptions I'm making based on a framework around this cycle that I'll explain as we go. And so you'll see that I titled this USD XXX Collaborative Team Impact Cycle because it is my belief that this cycle needs to happen at three levels. And that's the district leadership team, the building leadership team, and the collaborative team. And it should happen over a variety of data. And so in this assignment, I'm using a winter benchmarking period. And so it would be my assumption that the district leadership team is looking at winter benchmarking data as a district and making implications similar to these, but maybe not as much instructional level, but maybe more, why do we see more growth in this elementary than this elementary if they're using the same curriculum? And so there would be more district level conversations happening there. Building level would be having building-wide conversations. We see a lot of growth with our new math curriculum in grades 2 through 5, but we didn't see it in 6th grade. Are there some weaknesses in our curriculum there? What information could we go to the collaborative team to get to understand more what might be happening there? So for this one, though, like I said, I'm focusing on the collaborative team level. And what I did is I used some language from Barbara Pitchford and Paul Bloomberg's leading impact teams when I used the language of evidence, inference, and impact. And I was particularly drawn to this language because inference is an important word to me, because sometimes we forget that the data we're using is merely descriptive. It's not necessarily diagnostic. And so we are making an inference based on how diagnostic that data really is. And so that's the piece that I added there on the side as well, with the certainty of that inference should be proportionate to the scale of the impact. And so what I mean by that is if we're not confident in what inference we're making, we need to think about how can we make a smaller scale impact and formatively assess that to see, is our hypothesis correct before we blast this out to be bigger scale. That's also why I made my cycle here three-dimensional, because I want to think about how broad we're painting this impact. And so when I think about impact, I'm thinking of active impact, meaning I am impacting the instruction in this way, and then I'll come back and look at the evidence. So this is not looking at the impact. This is I'm going to actively impact in this way. And so again, when we think about, maybe I see that our students performed relatively worse on computation this screening period than last, that's a descriptive statistic. So there's a lot more questions we need to ask to say, are we using 10 minutes of computational fluency daily in our core or in our interventions? If we're not 100% sure what the issue may be, we may need to start small. So maybe we feel like it's possible that our kids are not understanding the concept of the math facts. And so that's a pretty large inference based on purely the data of our scores went down in computation. And so I would need to say, okay, well, in order to gain more certainty there, the first impact maybe I'm choosing is to do some formative assessments with my students around how well they truly understand multiplication, right? Do they really understand that multiplication is a certain number of groups of something, right? Or do they understand the scalability of multiplication? And so based on that formative assessment, that is the only impact I'm choosing, is that formative assessment. That's a very small scale impact because it's a very small certainty. Now, that formative assessment should inform how certain I am that that was the issue. Maybe I come back and I realize, yeah, these kids don't understand the concept of multiplication. Now I can go to a larger scale impact of, okay, we need to be utilizing some conceptual understanding of multiplication for 10 minutes daily. And that becomes a larger scale impact because that's impacting over a longer term. That's impacting truly a piece of my instruction daily. And so I wanted to get this three-dimensional level because I really want to give respect to the fact that we're using descriptive data to make an inference, and we need to be careful of how large scale of impact we make until we have the appropriate amount of data to feel a lot of certainty in that inference. So using this simple model, what I've done is I've put together, and this looks similar, if you guys are involved in a Kansas MTSS and alignment school, you'll see these winter grade level discussions. But what I've done is I've revamped it to change up just some of the questions based on some of the learning from this class. And so I would want the collaborative teams in the winter to look at their math benchmarking and answer some questions to help them understand what inference they may be willing to, what inference they're willing to make and what impact they're willing to commit to based on that. And so to begin with, it's just a simple question of, okay, what percent are we at in tiers 1, 2, and 3? And I do want to mention these questions are written in a way that they can work for reading data as well as behavior, social, emotional data, your early warning indicators. They're written to be something that could be paralleled in the other content areas. So when I'm thinking about math, tier 1, 2, 3, okay, I list what percent I'm at. I've done this also in the fall, and so right away, I not only say, okay, what subtests are we relatively stronger in, because typically math screeners have multiple assessments, and if not, then we could get rid of that question for that school. But also what subgroups of students are performing relatively variant to their peers. This is one that was hit on a lot in this class, is the idea of really looking at equitable practice based on your results. And so I want to look at, am I seeing different trends with different subgroups of students, and why is that the case? And so then with both of those two questions in mind, we need to think about, okay, how does this compare to the data in the fall, right? Because now we've had these students for a semester. What movement have we seen on subtests with subgroups? What have we seen change? What have we seen with our whole core change? And so based on that question, so this is fall from when they haven't had any of our instruction to winter where now they've had our instruction for a semester. Are we implementing what we said we were going to implement with fidelity? And how are we certain of that? Is core instruction explicit, systematic, scaffolded? Are we using, and these are the terms that I'm using particular to this school, right? So they've committed to making sure that their core is explicit, systematic, and scaffolded. So they're saying first, are we using core curriculum like we said we would? Because if not, this isn't really a true measure of what we have in place. Are we holding up to the expectations that we have set for ourselves? If not, it might be a good step. Are there sufficient examples, explanations, opportunities for students to practice new learning? Right? So are we getting enough data during the semester to see if students are mastering some of that new learning? And if so, how does that compare to our results here, right? In terms of differentiating the core, what do we see as relatively strengths or needs based on what movement we saw in this data? Do we need some professional development? Do we feel like we are implementing all of this with fidelity and we feel good about that? Or is it maybe that sometimes what looks like resistance is actually a lack of clarity? Maybe we need more clarity with more professional development on how to implement these things. Then this is another interesting one. Are there cross-curricular patterns? So although this is focused on math, we want to back up for a minute and say, are we seeing similar trends elsewhere? Because this may not just be a math content issue, right? And then finally, what inferences are we willing to make based on this data? So for example, is a core intervention, do we believe that's necessary? Do we think that our data is falling enough that we need to put a true intervention into the core for all students? Do we feel strong about any particular facet of our core? Then based on that inference, now we're ready to determine an impact. So like I said before, the first question is, how confident are we in this inference? And based on that, what should the scale of our determined impact be? So maybe we're saying, we're not completely confident, so let's start with some formative assessment, some additional formative assessments, right? Or maybe we say we're really confident that we don't know how to implement this curriculum. We need professional development. That's a larger scale impact. And then what impact are we willing to commit to? So I ask you those first two questions first to remind you, don't jump too far into conclusions until you have the data you need. How can we collect formative data along the way of whatever impact we chose? So that maybe we said something about computational fluency. Let's collect some formative data to strengthen our inference so that we can scale that impact more. Right? And then what is the summative goal? So what is it that I could have maybe also used the term, what's the lag measure, right? What is it that we want to see happen? Not that we're focused on this, but what should we see as a lag measure here, right? And the example I used is, we see this percent of students at benchmark on computation by the spring screening period, right? That's not the aim of this, but that should lag behind if we have chosen a good impact. And then finally, I included on here an organizer to make sure we're listing tasks, person responsible, begin date, and completion date. This is a piece from our framework in Canvas MTSS on alignment that I just modified to make work for this example as well. And the follow-up question, what information needs to go to building leadership teams? We've got to make sure that we continue that conversation, because if my grade level is seeing a similar trend to, if my fifth grade is seeing a similar trend to fourth, third, second, and we all feel like we need professional development, it's very important the building leadership team hears this. So this was my my protocol that I created. I really appreciated some of the information from this class, especially just thinking about what is truly variant performance based on the standard curve, standard deviations, as well as subgroup populations, and making sure that we're having equitable practice for all students rather than just paint a picture purely of the core, which really sometimes just looks at the majority of students, right? When we may have small subgroups that are not getting the instruction that they need. So thanks for a great class, and thanks for listening.